The last crust of bread trembled in Penelope Bryant's hands as she watched her 3 children sleeping on the thin blankets spread across the dirt floor of their lean-to, their hollow cheeks and sunken eyes breaking her heart more thoroughly than any loss she had ever endured. It was September 1876 in Fort Bowie, Arizona Territory, and the drought had turned the already harsh landscape into something resembling hell itself, driving away most of the ranch work that had kept food on their table after her husband died from fever the previous winter. She tore the bread into 4 pieces, setting 3 aside for morning and placing the 4th in her mouth, forcing herself to chew slowly even though every fiber of her being wanted to give it to her babies instead. The dawn came too quickly, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful if Penelope had any energy left for beauty. Her daughter Margaret was 6, her son Thomas was 4, and little Daniel had just turned 2 the month before. They woke hungry, as they always did now, and she gave them their portions of bread with water from the nearly empty bucket, watching them eat with the desperate intensity of a mother who would carve out her own heart if it would fill their bellies. "Mama, is Papa coming back today?" Thomas asked, his blue eyes so much like his father's that it hurt to look at them sometimes. "No, sweetheart, Papa is in heaven, remember? He is watching over us from there." Penelope smoothed his dark hair back from his forehead, feeling the heat of the sun already building even though it was barely past sunrise. Margaret, old enough to understand death in a way her brothers could not, said nothing, but her small hand found Penelope's and squeezed. The gesture brought tears to Penelope's eyes, but she blinked them away. Tears were a luxury she could not afford when there was water to find and work to seek and children to keep alive. She had tried everything. The handful of families still remaining in Fort Bowie had their own troubles, their own mouths to feed. The general store owner had extended credit until he could extend no more, his own supplies running low as the stagecoach routes became less reliable. Penelope had sold every item of value they possessed, down to her wedding ring and her mother's silver comb. She had taken in washing when there was washing to take in, mended clothes until her fingers bled, and even tried her hand at helping with the horses at the livery stable. But the work was sporadic, and the pay barely enough to buy flour and beans. That morning, after settling the children in the shade of the lean-to with strict instructions not to wander, Penelope walked into town. Her boots, worn through at the soles, kicked up dust with each step. Fort Bowie was not much of a town, really, just a collection of buildings clustered around the military fort that gave it its name. The soldiers stationed there were meant to protect settlers and maintain peace with the Apache, though everyone knew the peace was fragile as spider silk. The general store was her first stop. Mr. Henderson looked up from his ledger as she entered, and the pity in his eyes made her want to turn around and leave, but pride was another luxury she could not afford. "Mrs. Bryant," he said, his voice gentle, "I wish I had better news for you, but I cannot extend any more credit. My suppliers are demanding payment, and I have my own family to consider." "I understand, Mr. Henderson. I was hoping you might have work, anything at all. I can clean, organize stock, whatever you need." He shook his head slowly. "I am sorry. Business is so slow I have been considering closing up and heading back east myself. This drought has broken the back of this territory." Penelope nodded, swallowing against the lump in her throat. "Thank you anyway." She tried the saloon next, hoping they might need help in the kitchen, but the owner laughed in her face. "What I need help with? You are not the kind of woman to provide, Mrs. Bryant, and I mean that as a compliment. The blacksmith, the livery stable, even the fort itself, she tried them all." By the time the sun reached its peak, brutal and unforgiving in the cloudless sky, Penelope was trudging back toward her children with empty hands and an emptier heart. She had no idea what she would feed them that evening. She had no idea what she would feed them ever again. The lean-to came into view, and she saw Margaret standing outside, shading her eyes as she looked down the road. "Mama, there is a man coming, with a big wagon." Penelope felt a spike of fear. A lone man with a wagon could mean many things, and not all of them good. She hurried forward, positioning herself between her children and the approaching stranger. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. He was tall, sitting easy in the wagon seat despite the rough road, with a hat pulled low against the sun. The wagon itself was piled high with sacks and crates. He pulled the horses to a stop a respectful distance away and climbed down. When he removed his hat, Penelope saw a man perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and eyes the color of the sky before a storm. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but there was a kindness in his expression that made her relax slightly. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Name is Kenneth Vance. I heard in town that you might be in need of some assistance." Penelope stiffened. "I do not accept charity, Mr. Vance." "Good, because I am not offering any." He gestured to the wagon. "I have supplies here that need storing, and I have no place to store them. I was hoping you might have some space, and in exchange, you would be welcome to use what you need." It was the most transparent lie Penelope had ever heard, and the kindness of it brought those tears back to her eyes. "Mr. Vance, I appreciate what you are trying to do, but I cannot accept." "Mama," Margaret whispered, tugging on her skirt, "Thomas is so hungry." Kenneth looked at the little girl, then at the two boys peering out from behind their mother's worn dress, and something shifted in his expression. "Mrs. Bryant, I can see you are a proud woman, and I respect that, but pride does not keep children fed. I have more here than I can use before it spoils. Flour, beans, cornmeal, salt pork, dried apples. If you do not take it, it will go to waste, and that seems a sin when there are young ones going hungry." Penelope wanted to refuse. She wanted to hold on to her dignity, to the independence she had fought so hard to maintain since her husband's death. But Margaret's words echoed in her mind, and she looked at Kenneth Vance's honest face, and she found herself nodding. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will find a way to repay you." "No need. Just see that those children get fed. That is payment enough." He began unloading the wagon, and Penelope moved to help, but he shook his head. "You just tell me where you want things." The lean-to was small, barely large enough for the four of them to sleep in, but Kenneth carried the supplies inside with care, stacking them neatly along one wall. Flour, so much flour enough for months of bread and biscuits. Beans and rice and cornmeal, salt pork wrapped in brown paper. A tin of coffee that smelled like heaven. Dried fruit, and even a small sack of sugar. Penelope felt dizzy looking at it all, wealth beyond measure when measured in the currency of hunger. When the wagon was empty, Kenneth dusted off his hands. "There is a good spring about 2 miles north of here on the far side of that rocky outcrop. Water is clean and cold, runs year-round even in drought. Might be worth the walk if your well is running dry." "How do you know about that spring?" Penelope asked. "I have been working the ranches around here for the past few months. You learn the land when you spend enough time on it." He settled his hat back on his head. "I will be passing through again in a few days, just to make sure everything is holding up all right." Before Penelope could respond, he was back in the wagon and moving down the road, leaving a cloud of dust and a pile of supplies that felt like a miracle. That night, Penelope made biscuits and beans, and the children ate until their bellies were full for the first time in weeks. She watched them, these precious pieces of her heart, and thought about the man with the gray eyes who had appeared like an answer to prayers, she had been too exhausted to voice. Kenneth Vance. She turned the name over in her mind as she cleaned the dishes, wondering who he really was and why he had helped them. 3 days later, just as he had promised, Kenneth returned. This time he brought lumber and tar paper, and before Penelope could ask what he intended, he was measuring the lean-to and cutting boards. "What are you doing?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Roof needs reinforcing before the rains come, if they come. And these walls could use shoring up." He worked as he talked, his movements efficient and practiced. "Mr. Vance, you have already done too much." He paused, looking at her directly. "Mrs. Bryant, I know what it is like to have nothing and no one. When I was not much older than your Margaret there, my parents died of cholera. I was taken in by a ranch family who did not have much themselves, but they shared what they had. They told me that kindness is not a debt, it is a current, and it flows best when you let it pass through you to others. So please, let me do this. Let me be the current." Penelope felt something crack open inside her chest, some wall she had built to protect herself from more pain. "What do you get out of this?" "The satisfaction of knowing 3 children will sleep under a sturdier roof." He returned to his work, and Penelope found herself unable to argue further. Over the following weeks, Kenneth became a regular presence in their lives. He brought more supplies, though he always framed it as barter or trade, asking Penelope to mend his shirts or cook him a meal in exchange. She knew he was inventing reasons to help them, but she found herself looking forward to his visits, to the sound of his deep voice, and the way he made her children laugh. He taught Thomas how to whittle, sitting with the boy in the evening shade, and showing him how to shape wood into simple animals. He lifted Daniel onto his shoulders and walked around the property, pointing out birds and lizards while the toddler shrieked with delight. He brought Margaret a book, a real book with pictures, and the little girl clutched it to her chest like treasure. And he talked to Penelope, really talked about his life and hers, about dreams and losses and the strange persistence of hope even in the hardest times. She learned that he had worked ranches from Texas to California, that he was good with horses and better with cattle, that he had saved his money carefully with the dream of buying his own land someday. She told him about her husband, about the fever that had taken him so quickly, about the struggle to keep going when everything seemed designed to push her down. "You are the strongest person I have ever met," Kenneth said one evening as they sat outside, watching the sun set while the children played nearby. "You do not give up. Most people would have. I have children depending on me. Giving up is not an option." But Penelope felt herself soften under his praise, felt some of her exhaustion lift just from being seen and acknowledged. Still, strength like that is rare. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I bought some land, 20 miles east of here, near a creek that runs year-round. Good grazing, sheltered valley. I am going to start a ranch." Penelope felt something twist in her chest, something that might have been disappointment. "That is wonderful. You will do well, I am sure. I am going to need help. A ranch is too much for one man alone." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious. "I know this is forward, and I know you might not feel the same, but I would be honored if you and the children would come with me. Not as hired help, as my wife, as a family." The world seemed to stop. Penelope stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You cannot mean that. You barely know us. I know you are brave and good, and you love your children more than your own life. I know you work harder than anyone I have ever met. I know that when you smile, which is not often enough, it feels like the sun coming out." He reached over and gently took her hand. "I know I have thought about you every day since I first saw you standing here protecting your children. And I know I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to ration bread again." Tears spilled down Penelope's cheeks. "Kenneth, I cannot ask you to take on 3 children that are not yours. You are not asking. I am offering. And those children, if you say yes, they will be mine in every way that matters." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, the touch gentle and sure. "I do not expect you to love me, not yet, but I think maybe you could in time, and I already know I love you." Something broke loose inside Penelope, some dam that had been holding back hope and possibility. She thought about the past months, about Kenneth's steady presence and genuine kindness, about the way her children had blossomed under his attention. She thought about her husband, about the love they had shared, and she knew he would want her to live, to find happiness again, to give their children a better life. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Kenneth's smile was brighter than the setting sun. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, and Penelope felt warmth spread through her entire body, the warmth of being cherished and chosen. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church at Fort Bowie, with her children standing beside them and the handful of remaining townspeople there to witness. Penelope wore a simple dress that Kenneth had bought her, blue cotton that matched her eyes, and she carried wildflowers that Margaret had picked that morning. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Kenneth kissed her with such tenderness that she felt tears threaten again. The ranch became their home, and it was more than Penelope had dared to dream. Kenneth had built a solid cabin with 2 rooms, and he promised to add more as they needed. There was a barn for the horses and the small herd of cattle he had purchased, a chicken coop that Margaret delighted in tending, and that blessed creek running cold and clear through the property. The children adapted with the resilience of the young. Thomas followed Kenneth everywhere, learning to ride and rope and care for the animals. Margaret helped Penelope in the house and garden, her serious little face relaxing into smiles more often. Daniel, too young to remember much of the hard times, simply accepted Kenneth as a father, climbing into his lap in the evenings and falling asleep to the rumble of his voice. For Penelope, the adjustment was both easier and harder than she expected. The physical work of running a ranch was demanding, but she had never shied from hard work. The difficulty was in allowing herself to lean on someone again, to trust that Kenneth would not disappear like her first husband had, to open her heart when it was still tender from loss. Kenneth was patient. He never pushed, never demanded more than she was ready to give. He courted her as though they were not already married, bringing her coffee in the morning, taking her hand when they walked, stealing kisses that grew longer and deeper as the weeks passed. He told her she was beautiful, that he was lucky, that he fell more in love with her every day. And slowly, Penelope felt herself falling too. She fell for the way he listened when she talked, really listened, his full attention on her words. She fell for his gentleness with the children, the endless patience he showed when teaching them new skills. She fell for his strength, not just physical but emotional, the way he faced challenges with steady determination. She fell for the heat in his eyes when he looked at her, the desire that he kept carefully banked until she was ready for more. Their wedding night had been chaste, Kenneth holding her close but asking nothing more, telling her they had all the time in the world. But 2 months into their marriage, Penelope found herself wanting more than gentle kisses and careful touches. She wanted to be his wife in every sense, to give herself completely to this man who had saved her and her children, who had brought abundance from scarcity and joy from despair. That night, after the children were asleep in their small room, Penelope went to Kenneth where he sat by the fire. She took his hand and led him to their bed, and when he looked at her with questions in his eyes, she answered by kissing him with all the longing she had been holding back. "Penelope," he breathed against her lips. "Are you sure?" "I am sure. I love you, Kenneth. I think I have loved you since you brought that wagon load of supplies in your name, asking nothing in return." His smile was beautiful and bright, and then he was kissing her again, deeper this time, his hands trembling slightly as they traced the curves of her body. They came together in the firelight, slow and sweet and sacred, and Penelope felt the last pieces of her broken heart knit back together. This was different from her first marriage, different but no less real, no less true. This was a love built on crisis and kindness, on seeing each other at their worst and choosing each other anyway. Afterward, lying wrapped in Kenneth's arms, Penelope whispered, "Thank you for finding us. Thank you for not giving up on me even when I was too proud to accept help." "I would search 1,000 deserts to find you again," Kenneth replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You and the children, you are my whole world now." The months turned into a year and the ranch prospered. The drought finally broke, blessed rain returning to the parched land. Kenneth proved to be as good a rancher as he was a man, and their herd grew. They hired a hand to help with the work, a young Mexican man named Miguel who had his own story of hardship and was grateful for honest work and fair treatment. Margaret turned 7 and learned to read from the books Kenneth bought whenever he went to town. Thomas, nearly 6, could ride a horse as well as any adult. Daniel, 3 now and talking constantly, appointed himself the official greeter of every visitor to the ranch. Penelope watched them thrive, their cheeks filling out and their laughter coming easily, and she thanked God every day for the miracle of Kenneth Vance. In the spring of their 2nd year of marriage, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. She told Kenneth one evening after the children were in bed, nervous despite herself. "I know we already have 3 children, and I know that is a lot," but Kenneth cut off her words with a kiss, then dropped to his knees and pressed his face against her still flat belly. "A baby, our baby." When he looked up at her, there were tears on his cheeks. "I love Thomas and Margaret and Daniel with my whole heart, Penelope, but the thought of a child that is part you and part me, it overwhelms me." "You are happy then?" "I am more than happy. I am blessed beyond measure." He stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of spun glass. "I love you so much, more than I have words for." The pregnancy was easier than her previous ones had been, perhaps because she was not struggling to survive this time, not working herself to exhaustion trying to keep everyone fed. Kenneth treated her like a queen, doing all the heavy work and insisting she rest. The children were excited about a new baby, already arguing about names and whose turn it would be to hold the infant first. On a cool November evening, with the first winter winds starting to blow, Penelope went into labor. Kenneth rode hard to fetch the midwife from Fort Bowie while Miguel stayed with the children. The labor was long but not difficult, and when dawn broke over the ranch, a baby's cry split the morning air. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the squirming infant in Penelope's arms. Healthy and strong, Kenneth, who had paced a groove in the floor despite the midwife's assurances, came to the bedside and looked down at his son with such wonder that Penelope fell in love with him all over again. "He is perfect," Kenneth whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, my love. Thank you for this gift." They named him James after Kenneth's father, and he was indeed perfect. Dark hair like his father and blue eyes like his mother, a sunny disposition that made him easy to love. Margaret appointed herself his guardian, Thomas his entertainer, and Daniel his curious inspector. The cabin rang with noise and life and love. As James grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to expand. Kenneth bought more land, built a larger barn, increased the herd. He developed a reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle, and buyers came from as far as Texas to purchase his stock. Money, once so desperately scarce, became comfortable if not abundant. Kenneth built the addition to the cabin he had promised, giving the older children their own rooms and creating a proper parlor. But more than the physical improvements, what made the ranch a home was the love that permeated every corner. Penelope and Kenneth grew deeper into their marriage, their passion settling into something both comfortable and exciting, the kind of love that can weather storms because it is rooted in respect and friendship as much as attraction. They worked side by side during the day and fell into each other's arms at night, and Penelope sometimes had to pinch herself to believe this was her life now. The children flourished. Margaret, at 10, was reading books meant for adults and helping teach her brothers their letters. Thomas, 9, was becoming a skilled horseman and had a gift with animals. Daniel, 6, was the ranch's official comedian, always finding mischief and laughter. James, 3, toddled after his older siblings with determined devotion. One evening, as Penelope and Kenneth sat on the porch watching the sun set over their land, their children playing in the yard before them, Kenneth said, "Do you ever think about where we started? About that day I brought supplies to your lean-to?" "Every day," Penelope replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I think about how close we came to losing everything, how hungry the children were, how hopeless I felt. And then I think about you appearing like an answer to prayers, with your wagon full of food and your ridiculous story about needing storage." Kenneth chuckled. "It was a terrible lie. I am surprised you did not send me away." "I almost did." Pride is a funny thing. It can keep you from accepting the very help you need most. She turned to look at him, this man who had changed everything. "You saved us, Kenneth. You gave us back our lives." "No, love. You saved yourself by surviving as long as you did, by protecting your children against odds that would have crushed most people. I just brought the bread and gave you a place to rest." He kissed her temple softly. "And you gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to build something lasting." "We saved each other," Margaret called out then, asking if they could have a story before bed, and Kenneth stood, pulling Penelope up with him. "Come on, Mama, let's go tell our babies about knights and dragons." "They are hardly babies anymore," Penelope protested, but she was smiling. "They will always be our babies, even when they are grown with babies of their own." That night, with all 4 children tucked into their beds and the house quiet, Penelope lay in Kenneth's arms and thought about the strange paths life takes. 3 years ago, she had been rationing bread crusts and facing starvation. Now she had a full pantry, a thriving ranch, and a love so deep it sometimes took her breath away. The journey from that lean-to to this cabin had been improbable, almost impossible, but it had happened because one man had been kind when kindness cost him something. "What are you thinking about?" Kenneth murmured, his hand tracing lazy circles on her back. "About how much I love you. About how grateful I am that you did not just ride past that day. I could never have ridden past. Not once I heard about a widow and 3 children going hungry." He tipped her chin up so he could see her face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I believe some people are meant to find each other, that the universe conspires to bring souls together when the time is right. You and I, we were meant for this, for each other, for this family and this life. You believe in fate then. I believe in love. I believe in kindness. I believe in the way you looked at me that first day, all fierce mother bear protecting her cubs, and how I knew right then that I wanted to be part of your pride." He kissed her, slow and deep. "I believe in you, Penelope Vance. I believe in us." 2 years later, Penelope found herself pregnant again. A surprise baby that came when James was 5, and she had thought her childbearing days were likely finished. This pregnancy was harder, perhaps because she was older now, 32, and feeling every year of it. Kenneth worried constantly, hovering until Penelope had to shoo him away. "I have done this 4 times before," she reminded him when he fussed about her carrying water from the well. "I am not made of porcelain." "You are precious cargo," Kenneth insisted, taking the bucket from her hands. "Humor me, my love. Let me take care of you." How could she argue with that? She let him fuss, let the children pamper her, let herself rest more than usual. And when spring came and the baby decided it was time, the birth went smoothly despite her fears. This time it was a girl, red-faced and screaming her displeasure at the world. "A sister for Margaret," the midwife said, handing the cleaned and swaddled infant to Penelope. "What will you name her?" Penelope looked at Kenneth, who was gazing at his daughter with awestruck joy. "Rose." "After your mother, Rose Margaret Vance," Kenneth said, his voice thick with emotion. "Perfect." Margaret, 12 now and verging on young womanhood, was thrilled to have a sister. She helped care for Rose with such devotion that Penelope sometimes had to remind her that the baby was not a doll. The boys were less impressed initially, but even they softened when Rose would wrap her tiny fingers around theirs. Life on the ranch had settled into a rhythm, the seasons marking time in calving and planting, roundups and harvests. Kenneth hired more hands as the operation grew, building a bunkhouse and expanding the cattle operation into one of the most successful in the territory. But no matter how busy the ranch became, he always made time for his family, insisting on shared dinners and Sunday afternoons of rest. Margaret showed an interest in teaching, and they began making plans to send her to a school back east when she was old enough. Thomas, at 11, was already talking about becoming a rancher like his father, though Kenneth gently reminded him that he could be anything he wanted. Daniel, 8, loved music and played the harmonica Kenneth had given him with surprising skill. James, 5, was obsessed with horses and spent every possible moment in the barn. And Rose, when she was old enough to show personality, proved to be stubborn and fierce and absolutely determined to keep up with her brothers. The years passed in a blur of work and love, and the sweet exhaustion of raising children. Penelope's hair gained threads of silver, and lines appeared at the corners of Kenneth's eyes from squinting into the sun. But the love between them only deepened, aging like fine wine into something rich and complex, and utterly necessary to both of them. When they had been married 10 years, Kenneth took Penelope on a trip, leaving the children in the capable hands of Margaret, who at 15 was perfectly able to manage the household for a week. They traveled to San Francisco, taking the train west and staying in a proper hotel, a luxury Penelope had never experienced. Kenneth bought her a new dress, green silk, that made her feel like a princess, and took her to restaurants and theaters and showed her a world beyond the ranch. On their last night, standing on a balcony overlooking the city with the Pacific Ocean a dark expanse beyond, Kenneth pulled a small box from his pocket. Inside was a ring, a gold band with a small diamond that caught the lamplight. "I know I gave you a ring when we married," Kenneth said, "but it was simple because that was all I could afford then. I wanted to give you this to mark 10 years of marriage, 10 years of loving you more with each passing day." Penelope took the ring with trembling hands. "Kenneth, you did not need to do this. I love the ring you gave me. I know, but I wanted to. Please let me." He slipped the ring onto her finger beside her wedding band. "There. Now everyone will know that Kenneth Vance loves his wife more than life itself." She kissed him then, there on the balcony with the city lights twinkling below, and felt the same thrill she had felt the first time his lips had touched hers. Some loves fade with time, worn down by familiarity and routine. But theirs had only grown stronger, tempered by the challenges they had faced and the life they had built together. When they returned to the ranch, they were greeted by chaos. Not bad chaos, but the joyful disorder of children who had missed their parents. Everyone talked at once, showing off things they had done and asking about the city and demanding stories. Kenneth lifted Rose, now 4, into his arms while James attached himself to his leg. Margaret had managed everything perfectly, proving she was more than ready for the responsibilities of adulthood. Thomas had fixed a broken fence section on his own. Daniel had written a song about missing them. The house was full and loud and perfect. That night, after everyone was finally asleep, Penelope stood at the window of their bedroom and looked out over the ranch. The barn she and Kenneth had built together. The corrals where her children played. The garden that fed them. The hills and valleys that stretched away into the darkness. All of it, everything they had started with desperation and kindness, with a woman rationing bread for her babies and a cowboy who brought a wagon load of supplies and his name. Kenneth came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about, my love?" "About abundance. About how it comes in forms we do not always expect. I thought abundance was just having enough food, enough money, enough security. But real abundance is this, all of this. Children who are healthy and happy. Work that we love. Land that provides. And you, always you, loving me even when I was too broken to know I needed it. You were never broken, Penelope. You were bent under weight that would have crushed anyone else, but you never broke, and I did not fix you. I just stood beside you while you fixed yourself." He turned her in his arms so she faced him. "We fixed each other. We built this life together, board by board, day by day, choice by choice, and I would not change a single moment of it, not even the hard times. Especially not the hard times, because they brought us here, to this moment, to this life. The hard times taught us what we are capable of together." They stood there in the moonlight, holding each other, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting from the ashes of loss. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass. Inside, their children dreamed safe dreams. And between them flowed a love that had been tested and proven, that had survived hunger and hardship and emerged stronger for it. The years continued to unfold. Margaret did go east for school, becoming a teacher just as she had dreamed, though she returned to Arizona territory to teach, unable to stay away from her family and the land she loved. Thomas took over more of the ranch operations as Kenneth's hair turned fully gray and his joints complained about long days in the saddle. Daniel pursued his music, traveling to play in saloons and dance halls, but always coming home to the ranch eventually. James became a horse trainer with a reputation that spread far beyond their small corner of the territory. Rose, their youngest, proved to have a head for numbers and began managing the ranch's books and accounts. Grandchildren came, loud and numerous and adored. Kenneth built a swing in the big oak tree and pushed small bodies into the air while they shrieked with laughter. Penelope baked pies and told stories and held babies while their parents worked. The ranch that had started with one man's kindness became a legacy, passed down through generations who would never know hunger or desperation because their grandparents had faced it and triumphed. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. Children and grandchildren filled every corner of the much-expanded house, their voices blending into a joyful cacophony. Kenneth stood to make a toast, and the room fell silent. 25 years ago, I met a woman who changed my life. She was standing in front of a lean-to that barely deserved the name, protecting her children with nothing but her own fierce will. She had nothing except those 3 beautiful babies and a determination not to give up. I fell in love with her that day, though I did not fully understand it yet. He looked at Penelope, his eyes still holding that same warmth they had always held. I brought supplies because it was the right thing to do. I kept coming back because I could not stay away. And I asked her to marry me because a life without her in it seemed unbearable. Penelope felt tears on her cheeks as he continued. Penelope, you have given me everything. This ranch, yes, but more importantly, this family. These children and grandchildren who fill our home with life. You have given me purpose and joy and a love so deep it still takes my breath away. I was a lonely cowboy with a pocket full of savings and a dream of land. You made me a husband, a father, a grandfather. You made me whole. He raised his glass. To my wife, the strongest person I know, to 25 years and counting. To the woman who was rationing bread for her babies when I brought a wagon load of supplies and my name, never imagining she would give me her heart in return. The toast was echoed around the room, and Penelope stood, moving into Kenneth's arms as their family applauded. She looked around at all the faces, the children and grandchildren who existed because she had accepted help when she needed it most, because she had taken a chance on love when her heart was still healing, because Kenneth Vance had been the kind of man who saw people in need and did something about it. I love you, she whispered against his chest, then, now, and always. And I love you, my darling Penelope, my wife, my partner, my heart. They danced that night, slowly turning in the center of the room while their family watched, the same way they had danced at their wedding 25 years before. But so much had changed since then. They had changed, shaped by time and experience into new versions of themselves, versions that fit together even better than the originals. The young widow and the kind cowboy had become something more, something deeper, something that would last beyond their years into the memories and stories of generations to come. As the party wound down and the family began to drift toward beds and bedrolls spread throughout the house, Penelope and Kenneth slipped outside into the cool night air. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any competing light, the same stars that had watched over them from the beginning. "Do you remember what you told me once?" Penelope asked. "About kindness being a current that flows through you to others." "I remember. I have been thinking about that, about how your kindness to me flowed through to our children who learned from your example. And now I see that kindness in how Margaret teaches her students, how Thomas treats his ranch hands, how Daniel shares his music freely, how James gentles frightened horses, how Rose volunteers to help new families settling in the territory. Your kindness became a river, Kenneth, flowing out from that first act and touching so many lives." Kenneth pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "Our kindness, love. You taught them compassion and resilience. You showed them what it means to survive and to help others survive. I just brought the bread. You showed them how to share it." They stood there in the starlight, two people who had found each other in the hardest of times and built a life beyond imagining. The ranch slept around them, solid and real, proof that love and hard work could transform desperation into abundance. Inside, their family dreamed, safe and fed and loved, the great-great-grandchildren of that desperate day when everything changed. "Thank you," Penelope said softly. "For seeing me when I was invisible, for helping when I was too proud to ask, for loving me when I was too scared to love back, for building this life with me, for giving me reasons to hope and dream again. Thank you for saying yes, for taking a chance on a cowboy with more heart than sense, for making me a father to 3 children who needed one and then blessing me with 2 more, for every day, every moment, every breath we have shared." Kenneth kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips, "for being my home." They went inside together, hand in hand the way they had walked through every challenge and joy of their marriage. In their bedroom, in the bed they had shared for 25 years, They held each other close and listened to the house settling around them, to the breathing of sleeping children and grandchildren, to the sound of their own hearts beating in sync. Years later, when they were both old and gray and sitting in rocking chairs watching yet another generation of children play in the yard, Kenneth would take Penelope's hand and say, "Best decision I ever made, bringing that wagon load of supplies to a lean-to outside Fort Bowie." And Penelope would squeeze his hand and reply, "Best decision I ever made was saying yes when you offered your name along with that wagon load." They would rock in comfortable silence then, these two people who had saved each other, who had built an empire of love from nothing but determination and grace. The ranch would continue long after they were gone, run by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who would know the story of how it all began, of the woman who rationed bread for her babies, and the cowboy who brought abundance and asked for nothing but the chance to help. But that was still to come. For now, on this 25th anniversary with their family filling every room of the house they had built together, Penelope and Kenneth had everything they needed. They had each other, they had their children, they had a legacy of kindness and love that would ripple out long after they were dust. They had a full pantry and a full heart, and in the end, that was all the abundance anyone could ask for. The story of their love would be told and retold through the generations, becoming something of a legend in that part of Arizona territory. People would speak of Kenneth Vance, who saw a need and filled it without expecting anything in return. They would speak of Penelope Bryant, who became Penelope Vance, who survived impossible odds through sheer determination, and then built something beautiful from the ashes of loss. But most of all, they would speak of the love between them, the kind of love that transforms and endures, that makes the impossible possible and turns strangers into soulmates. And every year, on the anniversary of that first day when Kenneth drove up with his wagon full of supplies, the family would gather for a feast. They would break bread together, so much bread, more than anyone could eat, and they would remember where they came from. They would remember the lean-to and the hunger and the desperation. They would remember that abundance comes not from having everything, but from sharing what you have. They would remember that love is the greatest abundance of all, and that it multiplies rather than divides when given freely. The ranch would prosper for generations, becoming one of the most successful operations in Arizona. But its greatest success was not measured in cattle or acreage. It was measured in the lives touched by the kindness that had founded it, in the children who grew up learning that helping others was not optional but essential, in the love that flowed through every decision and action. Kenneth and Penelope's legacy was not wealth, though there was that. It was not land, though there was that too. Their legacy was the knowledge that one act of kindness, one moment of seeing another person's need and meeting it, could change everything. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were settled, Penelope and Kenneth would sit together and marvel at the life they had built. From rationing bread crusts to having pantries that could feed an army, from a lean-to to a sprawling ranch house, from desperation to abundance, from loneliness to love, they had traversed a journey that seemed impossible in retrospect. If someone had told me that day that the man with the wagon would become my husband, would become the father of my children, would become my entire world, I would have thought them mad, Penelope said one such evening. If someone had told me I would find the love of my life standing fierce and proud in front of a lean-to, ready to fight the world to protect her babies, I would have ridden out looking for her years earlier, Kenneth replied. They laughed together, the easy laughter of two people who had shared everything, who had no secrets, who knew each other as thoroughly as they knew themselves. And then they simply sat, holding hands, watching the sun set over their land, over the life they had built together from nothing but hope and hard work, and a wagon load of supplies that came at exactly the right moment. This was their happy ending, though it was not really an ending at all. It was a continuation, a story that would go on long after they were gone, told and retold until it became part of the fabric of the place itself. The story of she was rationing bread for her babies. The cowboy brought a wagon load and his name, and together they built something that would last forever. And in the end, when they were very old and their time came, they went peacefully, first Kenneth and then Penelope a few months later, unable to bear being without her other half. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to mourn and to celebrate, to honor two lives lived fully and together, to remember the love that had made everything possible. They were buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a stone that read Kenneth and Penelope Vance, who turned kindness into love and love into legacy. And the ranch went on as they had always intended, passing from generation to generation, each one adding their own chapter to the story, while never forgetting the chapter that started it all. The one about hunger and hope, about bread and abundance, about a cowboy and a widow who found each other at exactly the right moment and built something extraordinary together.